The Analog 3D is finally here. 4K Nintendo 64 gaming with an FPGA system. Analog did send the system over to me, and I got it a bit later than I think a lot of other reviewers did. And shout out to FedEx on that one. I did have a chance to spend a bit more time with the system. And on top of that, I was able to observe updates that's happened, not only from Analog, but also some other third parties, and kind of give, I think, a pretty good idea as to what we're looking at here with the new big 4K Nintendo 64 system. Starting with the unboxing, Analog continues their trend of this minimalistic approach, using an all-black box here with an imprint in the center that has the Analog logo and 3D. Removing the lid, we can see the main console along with an HDMI cable, a USB-C to USB-C cable for power, and the power brick for the wall. No controller is included here out of the box, but of course, it will work with original N64 controllers or the 8BitDo wireless, which we'll look at here shortly. With the system out, I noticed there was something else underneath, a quick start guide and a couple of cartridge cleaners. You just take the little rectangle pad and run it against your cartridge pins, and yeah, it looks like it works. Looking around the console itself, the power and reset buttons are in a similar spot to the original N64 console, with either one turned about 45 degrees to take on a more diagonal setup. The top-loading cartridge slot is also in a familiar spot, complete with spring-loaded plastic covers to protect from dust. The front has 4 original N64 controller ports and an LED that doubles as the sync button. Each port also has this little light to show when a wireless controller is taking up that slot. The back has a USB-C port for power, 2 USB-A ports, HDMI, and an SD card slot. Each side has a vent towards the bottom for additional airflow. I do like how the bottom of the console is completely covered in this rubberized material so that when the system is sitting, it has some added grip to the surface and won't accidentally slide around when it gets bumped. I mentioned the 8BitDo N64 controller that was made in collaboration with Analog for this release, and they sent a couple over for me to check out in both single player and multiplayer configurations. It's certainly set up to be a more traditional feeling controller than what Nintendo came up with for this generation, and really my only concern is the sensitivity of the stick, since third-party controllers tend to have a hard time getting the travel just right, resulting in a hard-to-control character on screen. After turning on the system and doing a quick update, I started dropping games into the Analog 3D, only to realize I was building up an entire library here of cover art and cartridges. It's important to note that this doesn't mean the games are loaded onto the system to play without having the cart inserted. What you're seeing here is a profile for each game that you can change up depending on how you want it to run or be displayed. I do like the straightforward look to the OS. It's certainly not flashy, but it is snappy and to the point, and that was the idea of Nintendo going with cartridges during this generation, to get you into the game quickly with basically no load times. The Analog 3D does immediately give you a way to play these games through HDMI at 4K, but with these different settings, you can completely change how it shows games on a more granular level. So for example, here with Rogue Squadron, I can go in and turn off anti-aliasing on the fly, keeping or eliminating that stair-step effect on this X-Wing here, adding scan lines and other effects to more closely mimic an older tube TV, or remove everything and make it clean like described here. This is what I went with, and while it does highlight some imperfections and a sort of image breakup on fast-moving objects, I think it looks great for the source that they're working with. The N64 did a lot to the image before it got to your TV, so having the ability to alter and change the image here how you want is awesome. Reminds me a lot of the Ultra HDMI that displayed at 1080p, just without having to do all the fine soldering. I couldn't find an option though for global settings. I had to go in and change each game I loaded up for the first time with the display configuration. In a future update, it'd be nice to have a global default option for display and overclocking settings, so it's already done when adding a new game. The system does support HDR, and when connected to a TV that supports it, the little selection toggle will illuminate, but unfortunately, there's no options outside of auto and off. HDR can be kind of finicky from display to display, so I would have liked to have seen more ways to adjust the HDR output to align with different brands, since not all HDR is built the same with the way TVs are advertised nowadays. I was able to get HDR enabled on my LG C5, and what was there looked pretty good, but unfortunately I don't really have any means of capturing HDR footage and showing it here. I've already seen some people online complain about how the HDR function looks on their TV, so this should be one of the first things Analog looks into with a firmware update, as it is one of the big advertised features next to 4K. But with all that said, my favorite feature by far is the overclocking. You can mod an original N64 controller to quote-unquote overclock it, but what you really end up doing is simply speeding up gameplay. This, though, on the Analog 3D is a legitimate overclock to where games with poor frame rates will run significantly better. It's immediately noticeable, especially with the responsiveness in games. This wasn't exactly the era of great frame rates, and most times we just sort of lived with sub 20 FPS games. This is probably the reason some of these games were catching me by surprise. I'm not used to seeing some of these cartridges perform like this. Beetle Adventure Racing felt a little too responsive at high speeds. Rogue Squadron was carving up corners, and Turok 2, it wasn't a slideshow. See, some of these games have high res mode, where if an expansion pack is detected, it'll give you the option or even just default to a higher internal resolution during gameplay. The problem was, the N64 really couldn't keep up most times, and while things would look better in still frames, it would be terrible in motion. The overclocking here makes it so the high-res mode just plays with a good frame rate and is actually a serious game changer. I decided to really put things to the test with a few games here. The first was Perfect Dark, that was infamous for crushing performance, especially in 4-player split screen with bots running around. I had to do my best moving around multiple players at once to see things and how they would hold up, and while it wasn't running perfect, like a perfect frame rate, it wasn't single digits, which is what we put up with back in 2000. Banjo-Tooie was another problem game that's been pointed out a lot for pushing the N64 to its limits with a chugging frame rate pretty much all the time. Moving it to Unleashed Overclock on the 3D immediately makes the game smooth across the board, and for a 3D platformer like this, the entire experience becomes significantly better. So good news here for Banjo-Tooie fans. I also fired up Superman 64, and I know you might be confused on this one, but the frame rate was a big part as to why this game was so hard to play, keeping most people from getting past the first level where you fly through rings. So I gave it a shot, and on the second try, I went right through with time to spare. Even the second row of rings went down with 20 seconds to spare, with a lot of credit going to the game actually feeling easier to control. Small adjustments would happen immediately, and it was less common to steer too much in one direction. You want a good slogan for advertising on the front of the Analog 3D box? Try this one. Make Superman 64 somewhat playable. Oh, and I do like that the 8BitDo wireless controller can turn on the system by just pressing start. Sure, you still have to get up to change cartridges out, but if you're spending several days playing through maybe one game, this is a nice feature to have. So you just walk in the room, press start on the controller, and by the time you're sitting on the couch, the TV would be on with the system ready to go. Also, if you have a flash cart like the EverDrive, you probably won't need to be changing carts much anyway, but there is a bit of an issue right now with compatibility. It seems at this time it's extremely touch and go for which of these flash carts even work with the Analog 3D. I can tell you my EverDrive worked fine, but other people I've talked to couldn't get theirs to work at all. It does appear to have something to do with which version of EverDrive you have. At the very least, I can tell you the version 3.06 cartridge worked fine for me. The good news is, after the system officially released, it looks like the creator of the EverDrive has been hard at work pushing firmware updates for the flash cart to make it work with Analog 3D. At this time, it seems that with the latest update, the EverDrive carts are being detected and booting with some caveats. The overclocking feature is limited to enhanced when using a game from the EverDrive, and in order to apply the update, you need to insert the cartridge into an original N64 console for the bootloader to be applied. It's a one-time thing, but isn't great news for EverDrive owners out there who need to track down an OG console after just getting in their Analog 3D. Crix has mentioned that any EverDrive shipped out going forward will have the new update already loaded, so if you were going to buy one in anticipation of picking up the Analog 3D, you should be in the clear. I don't want to let Analog completely off the hook, though, for this situation, since it is their system, that they themselves boast compatibility as a leading feature, so I'd like to see some work on their end through updates to help make these different flash carts work like they would on original hardware. Oh, and I'll be that guy real quick. The N64 DD does not work with the Analog 3D. me and like 4 other people seeing this right now are livid. While the Analog 3D does have Wi-Fi built in, at this time it seems like they really only have that figured out for updates to the system. And you can update it a couple of ways. For example, the SD card in the back is the way that I updated the system. You remove it, you then put it into a PC and just move over the update file that's listed on Analog's website. You're also able to plug in that USB-C plug on the back of the system to a PC, and that would also allow you to move the update file over. And then I guess here in the future, we'll mostly rely on over-the-air updates using that Wi-Fi. I think it would be kind of neat if they figured out ways to let you tunnel, say, multiplayer through Wi-Fi online, and then you could house sort of your own 4-player GoldenEye split-screen experience and do everything through the internet, as long as, of course, everyone also has an Analog 3D. Just something fun that would be cool if maybe they have that on the docket for a future update. All right, now let's take a look inside the Analog 3D. And a quick look around the device, I figured screws were hidden under the big rubberized mat on the bottom, and after slowly peeling it off, I found several Torx screws along with a metal plate. After removing a number of screws, the metal slides to unlock, and then it lifts up. This is something I've seen Analog do in the past where they add extra weight, so it's a bit more bottom-heavy of a device. It does make the whole thing feel more premium, but more importantly, makes it more stable in combination with that rubberized bottom. Now we can see a fan along with 2 ribbon cables. I popped both free and removed another screw that freed up this top board, which ended up being the entire cartridge slot. I guess it's nice that it's modular, since if the pins get damaged or dirty, you could in theory replace it with a new one, provided you can find the part. The other ribbon cable is for the front controller ports, with that board also being fully modular. We can see a fairly large heatsink paired with the fan that initially seemed like overkill, but with the idea of overclocking the chip, it's probably better to be safe with additional headroom for temperature control here. A couple of screws need to be loosened to lift the heatsink and fan combo. It's basically a slab of flat copper with aluminum fins for the fan to push air through. It also makes contact with the RAM chips underneath, so the cooling solution here does seem to be really well thought out. After cleaning the thermal compound off this chip, we can see it is indeed that Cyclone 10 GX chip, which was advertised on Analog's website. At this time, it's the most capable chip being used in a retro system like this, and it makes sense why we're seeing things like 4K and improved frame rates. For example, the Mister uses a Cyclone 5 chip, which is about half as capable as this 10GX. The large chip is surrounded by what looks to be 2 different pools of RAM. I believe these are all 256 megabyte chips, but they've been grouped onto either side, with one being responsible for simulating the N64 function and the other set up to accommodate the 4K output. It's an interesting setup, but certainly one that the Cyclone's up for. Towards the back, we can see the wireless chipset along with antennas for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. The board is higher quality and isn't flimsy by any measure, but everything is soldered completely to the board, including USB ports, SD card slot, and HDMI, so repairability here isn't going to be easy if any of them get damaged. Still, it's a well-built system that isn't really skimping out on much. I noticed the fans spin up when I would first turn on the system, but otherwise, even with full overclock turned on, it's not very audible, and seeing the cooling setup here explains it. This is not a cheap system by any means, but I can at least see where the money is going here, and with all the functionality that's added on top of just playing these games at 4K, this is an easy recommendation for any Nintendo 64 enthusiast out there. As it stands, the Analog 3D is a really impressive system, so it's quite head-scratching why there wasn't much being shown on the build-up to its release. I know there were several delays since its announcement, but things like the overclocking feature going largely under the radar, along with a really impressive suite of visual options, seems like stuff that would have made the system not only look more legitimate before release, but also just downright exciting. At this time, the Analog 3D is set at $270, which is a $20 increase from the original $250 pre-order amount. Keep in mind, you'll also need a controller, and whether it's an original or the 8BitDo wireless, you'll probably end up around $300 all in. Compared to my Ultra HDMI, this system does significantly more and actually comes in cheaper with what that ended up costing years ago, and even more so now with how rare those builds are. It's hard not to recommend the Analog 3D for longtime N64 fans or even someone looking to get into this generation for the first time. This system, paired with a flash cartridge, is an incredible combination, so here's hoping Analog can actually stock the thing going forward. And really the bottom line, I am happy to see that the Nintendo 64 sector is starting to get some options for more modern displays, or people who are looking for better experiences even across the board over the original hardware, having the Analog 3D come out, and then also some competition coming up with the M64, Mod Retro making a bunch of their own promises here for their device. It's a really cool thing to see happen, and I am very curious to see where all this goes, as the Analog 3D has a bunch of updates that they're working on, and I'm sure vice versa for the M64. But I'd say a very good offering here to get things started with the Analog 3D. Certainly checks a lot of boxes, and I think it's a good option for someone who's just out there looking to experience the N64, either for the first time or revisit their childhood with even original cartridges. But let me know what you guys think about this down below in the comments. Were you thinking about picking one up, or did you already get yours in, and what do you think of it? Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.